What's up, everybody? Welcome to part 2 of the Thomas Take Sports Podcast. I'm Ryan Thomas. I'm your host, once again bringing you my favorite hobby, my new obsession, this podcast. Part 1 talked about UFC 207, and in part 2 I'm going to talk about UFC Fight Night. UFC Fight Night Saturday night in Sacramento, California. Most people know this event as the Swan Song for the California Kid, Uriah Faber, calling it a career after this fight in which Uriah Faber will be taking on Brad One Punch Pickett. That's a very exciting fight. I'll get to that a little bit later, the actual fight itself. But first, I want to talk a little bit about Uriah Faber, the California Kid, the former WEC featherweight champion, the guy that defended the belt 4 times in the WEC, a guy that really helped build the UFC featherweight weight class, a guy that really helped build the ability for fighters to be in those weight classes and get some notoriety, which led to the UFC bantamweight weight class, which led to the UFC flyweight weight class. Uriah Faber's legacy will live on in mixed martial arts history. Although one feat did avoid him, getting that UFC belt, very similarly to Dan Henderson, what Uriah Faber did for the lower weight classes. They had very similar impacts on the sport of mixed martial arts, and it's very similar to what BJ Penn did for the UFC lightweight division, being the champion that he was, the dominant champion that he was, taking on all comers. Uriah Faber did the same thing in the WEC. He ran into Jose Aldo, which caused him to lose his belt, but then he dropped down to 135, making that being a real draw in that weight class from the purchase of the WEC by the UFC, in which they merged with the WEC. Uriah Faber was the first guy to fight in the UFC as a former WEC fighter, and it was a very good fight between him and Eddie Wineland, where he won the fight in dominant fashion. A guy that will always be known for taking on Jens Pulver and Mike Brown and Jose Aldo once and twice. Guy that'll be always known for taking on Dominic Cruz 3 times. I mean, he had some very amazing bouts inside the octagon, and he's going to be missed. I don't think we'll ever see a guy like Uriah Faber again. There's only one, Uriah Faber, and what he did for the sport in its infancy. He talks extensively about how his first fight he fought in at an Indian reservation casino, and he made $200 for that fight. And I actually watched that fight, and it was at a hole-in-the-wall casino. And it's very interesting that he's lived the life that he has over the course of MMA's. His career has grown along with the sport, and that's been very interesting. He's lost 10 fights in his career, record of 33-10. He's going for his 34th win, 19 of which by submission, 7 by knockout, and 7 of his 10 losses have been by decision, 2 of which were to Dominic Cruz. So he's a guy that has had some hard slumps, some down and out times. He's towards the end of his prime, without a doubt. And this was the perfect time for him to call it quits. I'm looking at the guys that he fought: Michael McDonald, Frankie Edgar, Ivan Menjivar, Brian Bowles, Eddie Wineland, Mizugaki, Rafael Assunção, Jens Pulver, Jeff Curran, just guys that have been involved in mixed martial arts for quite some time. And it's very interesting career that he has had. The scope in which he has put eyes on the sport has been very entertaining, very interesting. And it'll be sad to see him go. But on to the actual fights. Paige Van Zandt is the headliner. Paige Van Zandt versus Michelle Waterson. Paige 12 Gauge Van Zandt versus Michelle the Karate Hottie Waterson. 2 of the most well-versed fighters in the UFC strawweight division, and 2 of the most beautiful fighters in the UFC. That's definitely a part of the marketing tools for the UFC. You have one beautiful Paige Van Zandt, one gorgeous Michelle Waterson, two girls that the looks of them, they don't look intimidating. They look like, girls that you would see, nurses. They look like, nurses. They don't look like fighters. They look like they couldn't hurt a fly. But then they're inside the octagon, and they tear heads off. They kick heads off. Point being, Paige Van Zandt, when she did a switch head kick knockout to Bec Rawlings in her last fight, that really launched Paige Van Zandt into the stratosphere, along with her appearance on the Dancing with the Stars TV show, in which she was the runner-up on that season. So Paige Van Zandt has really helped her image. She's really been able to expand her marketability from those two things alone, from the Bec Rawlings fight and from her time on Dancing with the Stars. She's reached the casual audience, so to speak. And Michelle Waterson has been in the mixed martial arts game for a long time, in the jiu-jitsu circles and the karate circles. She was the first atom weight champion in mixed martial arts as a female, which is 105 pounds in another organization. She's been around for quite some time. It could be said that her tool belt, or the tools that she has in her toolkit are very elusive in comparison to Paige Van Zandt. And that says a lot, because Paige Van Zandt is a real athlete. She's very elusive in her striking, her kickboxing. She's proven to be an improvisational striker. And Michelle Waterson is very similar. So this is a perfect fight for both fighters. Michelle Waterson is looking to gain a little bit of the casual audience off of a win off of Paige Van Zandt. And Paige Van Zandt's looking to get that legitimacy off of a win versus Michelle Waterson. Perfect clash of careers. Now, I do think Paige Van Zandt has grown leaps and bounds in her last few fights. She did have that drubbing by Rose Namajunas probably a little over a year ago. She took a lot of time off after that, where she really was ripped open, bleeding very badly. It was a bloody, grueling fight. 5 rounds. She went 5 rounds with one of the toughest women in the UFC, in Rose Namajunas. And I don't know how much her game has evolved since then. There's been moments in her fights where she's looked a little shell-shocked. And against an experienced fighter like Michelle Waterson, I have to go with Michelle Waterson for this fight. I think Paige Van Zandt's grown leaps and bounds, but I don't know if she's grown enough yet to beat a girl like Michelle Waterson, who's been around a good amount of time, and she's very much entering her prime. It'll be very interesting. The co-main event is a fight that was made by Mickey Gall himself inside the UFC octagon after he had dismantled CM Punk in one of the biggest publicity stunts in UFC history. CM Punk fought Mickey Gall in his first MMA fight. Mickey Gall, a rising prospect, on Dana White's Looking for a Fight, announces that he wants to go after CM Punk, and Dana White brings him on and says, you're more than welcome to come into the UFC and fight CM Punk. And the fight took basically 2 years for it to actually happen, and CM Punk did not last too long. Mickey Gall won the fight. Mickey Gall says, I want Sage Northcutt. Sage Northcutt is a prodigy. Super Sage Northcutt. He's won numerous amount of kickboxing titles dating back to when he was age 4, and he was age 4 or 5. In one of the youngest divisions of kickboxing in the country. And he was kicking guys and kicking kids and winning belts when he was a child. So he's been in this game for quite some time. I'm going to go with Sage Northcutt on this one for that reason only. Sage lost one fight inside the UFC. He had staph infection. Dana White admitted that he should not have been fighting that night. So virtually Sage Northcutt is undefeated since he came into the UFC. I think Sage Northcutt is going to be one of the youngest UFC champions in the history of the UFC, in the history of mixed martial arts as well. So I'm going to go with Sage Northcutt for that one. Last but not least, the before-mentioned Uriah Faber, the California kid. Uriah Faber's coming off 2 losses, one to Dominic Cruz at UFC 199, and the other to Jimmy Rivera at UFC 203, I believe. So Uriah Faber has looked very lackadaisical in his last two fights, very shell-shocked as far as unwilling to really throw, unwilling to really attack. And Brad Pickett has the type of power that if he lands one punch, he's going to put you out. So this is a very interesting test for Uriah Faber. These are two guys that were both in the WEC that never fought each other. So this is a great fight for Uriah Faber to end his career on, and I do think Uriah Faber will end it on a winning note. Brad Pickett, Brad Pickett has a few bumps and bruises along the way. He's been knocked out a few times in his last few fights. I'm wondering if his chin is starting to go. I think realistically, Brad One-Punch Pickett has just that, a one-punch knockout power shot, and other than that, I don't really know what he would threaten Uriah Faber with in his toolkit. So it'll be very interesting to see how Brad Pickett fights Uriah Faber, but I'm going to go with Uriah Faber for that fight. So my 3 picks for this event, for UFC Fight Night, which is this Saturday night on Fox. The main event, I'm going to go with Michelle Waterson. I think she's too experienced for Paige Van Zandt. I think Van Zandt obviously has grown leaps and bounds in her striking game in the last year. I'm gonna go with Michelle Waterson. The co-main event, I'm gonna go with Sage Northcutt with a victory over Mickey Gall, and in the men's bantamweight division, in the last fight of the California Kid's career, Uriah Faber. I see Uriah Faber getting the W, riding off into the sunset. But last but not least, one thing that I do wish to bring up is the fact that Uriah Faber did make it out of one fight not happening in his UFC career. And I hope that maybe Uriah does decide to stick around for one more fight with B.J. Penn. I've always wanted to see Uriah Faber fight B.J. Penn. That fight was a fight that never happened, and that fight is on my list tomorrow, for tomorrow's episode. If you have not checked out my Facebook page, Thomas Take Sports Podcast, I'm going to put out a list of 10 UFC fights / MMA fights that never happened. I just gave you guys one. B.J. Penn and Uriah Faber, the California Kid, the featherweight WEC champion versus the longtime UFC lightweight champion. My dream fight would be this fight at featherweight for both BJ and Uriah Faber. If you put them in like the Rocky Balboa type CompuBox video game, be BJ Penn in his prime at 145, Uriah Faber at his prime at 145. That would have been a very good fight. Take care, guys. Tune in tomorrow. 10 UFC fights that never happened. Stay tuned for it. Thank you for listening to the Thomas Take Sports Podcast. I'm Ryan Thomas. I'm out.